welcome again, everybody, to the greater community. The idea behind this show is to highlight ministries both locally and globally to give you a bigger picture about what God is doing, maybe in ways that you never thought possible. And so today, got my good friend Lee Jost with us. Lee and I have known each other for several years. We've had a lot of these conversations. This just happens to be an opportunity for us to capture one of these. And so you might be listening to this as a podcast. You might be seeing it in its video form on YouTube, but excited to have Lee with us. So Lee, tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're doing.
So I'm a pastor here in Olathe, Kansas. I've been doing ministry most of my career, all of my career, really. That's what I've done. Planted the church, Christ the Servant Church in Olathe about 10 years ago. And we're a house church, small congregation, mighty group, but a small group. And that's what I'm doing. I'm married, have a wife, 3 kids, granddaughter, no dogs, no cats. That's it. So pretty simple.
Well, when we talk about, when we talk about churches and house churches, people might have different ideas about what that means. I know your specific church and your vision for a church is a little bit different, and that might even be implied in the name of your church. So yeah, how would you say Christ the Servant's a little bit unique compared to some other churches that people might be familiar with?
Well, so I'll give you a little bit of my own history to kind of lead up to that. Doing vocational ministry, I spent most of my career in youth ministry. And so I would say the first 15 years of ministry was all working with teenagers. Loved it. Started really feeling like I was watching teens who would do stuff in youth group, and you know what it's like, Tom. They'd get to go on all the cool mission trips. We played basketball. We had water balloon fights. We ate pizza. We did movies. I mean, just everything. Just this constant engagement. And it didn't matter whether we were at church or whether we were out in the community. It was just connecting and doing stuff together. And then when we get to mission trips, they would just dive in deep, wholehearted, dive in deep, and loved to do the stuff and the work. Then I started watching these kids get to college and eventually leave the church altogether.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And as they left the church, I'd talk about why. And they would all say things like, well, it's just, you get to big church and it's just about going to the worship service on Sunday. There just doesn't seem to be this engagement that they were missing. So for a long time, I felt like we needed a church that was engaged, active, looked outward in the community. In youth ministry, I would spend as much time in the office or more time in the community than I was in the office.
Right.
And that was where I was.
Right.
So I began to consider that. I came on staff at Hillcrest Covenant Church. That was my first job in adult ministries. And I was the pastor of adult ministries at Hillcrest Covenant Church. And at the time, Mark Severson was there. And he said, I told him in the interview that in the next 5 years, I believed I was supposed to plant a church. I knew that. I didn't know what it was supposed to look like. I didn't have a clear vision of what it would be.
Yeah.
But I just knew a church that was active and engaged.
Yeah.
And so they called me back for a second interview. I told them that again, and they said, "That's great. That's why we're looking at you." And then they called me back for a third interview with the staff, and I told all the staff the same thing. Yeah. This is what I think I'm supposed to do in the next 5 years. And then they hired me, and Mark said, "Well, within a year of me being there, they said, well, we're looking at doing a church plant." And it was a multi-site, so it was, kind of a similar iteration of what Hillcrest was already doing as a video campus. And I helped out some, and when I finally realized that what this really was going to be was a video campus,
yeah,
I started backing out of that leadership. And over that next year, I tried to remove myself, and Mark finally said, "We're just going to have you be the campus pastor." And so I loved Hillcrest, I loved the church, and I thought, I will buy in, but I told Mark at that point, I said, "I'll give you a year. And in that year, I want to do a church planters assessment, and I want to learn as much as I can about building teams and budgets and all that.
Yeah.
But eventually it'll be me going out and launching a church.
Yeah.
So we did. A year and a month later, February of 2010, we went out and launched Christ the Servant. So that's how it got me to this place.
Yeah.
The year that I went out to launch Christ the Servant, that January, I took a position with Johnson County's Drug and Alcoholism Council. And the reason I did that, and it's not a faith-based group, it is a group of community members and civic leaders and governmental organizations and nonprofits that administer about $1.5 million worth of alcohol tax funds that come into Johnson County. So every time somebody buys a beer or a glass of wine at the restaurant, there's a tax on that. Oddly enough, that tax has to be dedicated to substance abuse prevention, treatment, and education.
Yeah, interesting.
So I took a position there because my goal in starting a church was to figure out where are the gaps in the community. And then how can a faith community be uniquely gifted to serve in one of those gaps?
So let me stop you right there, because I think that's such a different set of priorities for a church. I think a lot of times when people think about starting a church, it's like, okay, where are we going to meet? That's the first, task. And then what does Sunday morning look like? What does worship look like? What's our style going to be? What's our format going to be? Who's our audience? But you kind of had a different set of priorities, and that's kind of shaped your church, right?
Yeah, that has shaped the church. It has created some of its own barriers, but also it has released us from some of the weightier things that can kind of slow our engagement in the community down.
Yeah.
When I went to do my church planters assessment, that was one of the things that I wrote as I had this vision in 2009. I did my assessment, and the vision was a church that would focus on what the needs were in the community rather than focusing on filling our own needs.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds like we need both churches.
Right.
We need both ways of engagement.
Right.
One of the things that's been a barrier for us is families who have young children who want to see their young children grow up in these nurturing and discipling environments have tended not to stick with our church.
Yeah.
Because we don't have those youth and children's programs. Now we have young adults, we have teens, we have little kids in our church, but these are folks who've made an effort. Some of them even have kids that go to programs at other churches midweek.
Yeah.
So in doing that, we made some value decisions early on. And those value decisions really drove our ability to stay nimble and stay engaged and focused in the community.
And so as you're looking at those gaps, I'm sure the target is sort of shifted from, what you thought you were going to be investing your time into, or what gap you thought you were going to be meeting in year one versus the gap you are currently meeting in year 10. So how does that process evolve, and how do you start to understand what those gaps are? I guess that's the question. Is I think a lot of times churches talk about meeting needs. We want to meet the needs of our community, but how did you go about determining A, what those needs are, and B, what resources you had to meet those needs? How did you go about doing that?
So I wish I could say to you right now, God gave me this crystal clear vision from the beginning.
Yeah.
And from start to finish, it's exactly what God planned. But I live by the axiom, it's better to be lucky than good any day. So how that process looked, when we first started our launch team for Christ the Servant, we had this group of people that met together on a regular basis, and we were at some friends of ours, Randy and Cheryl Reinhardt, their house. We met in their basement. And we were praying, God, what do you have for us? Early on, one of the things I was also involved. So I guess you realize that there are things you haven't shared yet, right? So, so part of this is I was, for the last 3 years before planting a church, I was a part of the Olathe Parent Leadership Institute. So I was a group of parent leaders, a handful from across the district that were being trained up as parent leaders within the district. We weren't elected people, we were volunteers, we were helping with PTOs and programs.
And what led you to be involved in that initiative? 'Cause
Um,
it seems like, you talk about, I stepped on this, right? And these are not necessarily intuitive places that you find a lot of pastors stepping into. So what was your decision-making process to say, yeah, I want to be a part of that?
so that was my kids. I was involved in my kids' school. I was, at the time, I was helping out. There was a program called Watchdogs.
Yep.
And Watchdogs are these dads of great students. That's what the dogs is about, dads of great students. So these dads would come on a given day during the lunch hour, and they'd kind of hang out in the lunchroom and just kind of be there for kids. It was a way to get dads engaged.
Right.
And Justo Cabanas was the guy at our school that started it. And this was early on. And so I got to be a watchdog. And the more I did that, I realized, wow, this teacher needs some help after school with some kids that need some tutoring. So I did that. And then I said, well, I can help with the book club. I like to read fun books. And so I did a book club. It was just, these are things most parents do. You know what I mean? They find ways to get involved in their kids' schools. And as I did, and I got involved, that involvement came with some conversations with our building administration, me asking questions. But it always came from this posture. Where are the gaps and how am I gifted to serve? That's just kind of my thing, is I've got gifts. I want to put them somewhere, but I don't want to just assume I know where those places are. I want to ask.
Yeah. So the bottom line, it sounds like you just really have a desire to be helpful. And so, and you have some background of, these are things I know I can do. And it's not necessarily like this is rocket science. It's just, I want to be helpful. And so these are the ways I can help, it seems like.
Sure. So I do think it's about being helpful. I think there are, theologically, I think there are some things that point us as faith communities and individuals in the churches. There are things that point us to serving.
Mm-hmm.
Scripture's clear. We're all given a gift for a reason.
Yeah.
That the purpose of that gift isn't to hide it. If you use the parable of the talents that way, it's not to hide it. Matthew talks about how there's sheep and goats, and the sheep are the ones who are saying, when were you hungry? When were you thirsty? And if we push that parable a little bit, we're asking Jesus, when were you, Jesus, hungry? When were you, Jesus, naked? And so I've always taken that to heart. Part of it is cutting my teeth in youth ministry and doing that so long. That was a normative way for me to be in ministry, engaged outside of the physical building of the church.
Yep.
And the other part of that is just a clear call to be a part of serving in the community.
So you take this posture of wanting to be helpful. It's a natural fit. You're involved with the schools. So how does that play into, as you're planting this new church, how does that play into some of these things coming together?
So I have all these things going on. We start meeting as a group, and you're really good at keeping me on track, Tom. This is really good. I see why you do this via Zoom. You can keep me on track. So we're meeting with this group, and we begin praying and asking God, where are you leading us? We used a tool called Compassion by Design. I don't think it's even around anymore, but the tool Compassion by Design was for churches to really do community needs assessments and identify gaps in the community, find maybe populations that are underserved or underrepresented, and then discern in your group, what skill sets do we have to address the gaps that we're seeing? So we started doing that as a church. And one of the early things we started doing, because of my relationship with the public schools, is we knew in Olathe there was a gap in supports for families who were Spanish speaking at home.
Mm-hmm.
So we started building our launch team. Our launch team included 2 families that were Puerto Rican born families that spoke Spanish in the home. fluent in English, but spoke Spanish in the home.
Mm-hmm.
We started building relationships with a couple Latino congregations in our community. We even early on had scripture read in Spanish, or we would have prayer in Spanish. I don't speak a word of Spanish.
Yeah.
The issue wasn't me. The issue was, what can we do to build a bridge into the community?
Right.
Tom, we did that for the first probably almost 2 years of the church. We met together with other churches. We did special worship services every every quarter.
Mm-hmm.
We did all kinds of things. Never once did we feel like we've really caught the sails filled with wind and we were moving somewhere.
Yeah.
So what happened was we just kept discerning. One Sunday, back to the Reinhardts, we're meeting in their basement. And now we're finally meeting in a public school. 2 years into this, we're meeting in a little public school in the auditorium.
Now, at this point, are you, in your mind, are you thinking I'm on the pathway to having a building? Like, is that your mindset of like, we're meeting in a house and now we're meeting in a school? Or is it just, you just happen to meet in a school because that's the space that works?
No, we met in a school intentionally. From the beginning, we did not want a building.
Okay.
We were, and I wouldn't say we, as a core group of leaders, we did not want a building. There were folks in the church that thought we needed to get a building in order to be a church. And I kept saying, the minute we get a building, we're going to be strapped with a mortgage. We're going to be strapped with overhead. We're going to be strapped with all the responsibilities of fixing the thing. Or if we're just leasing a building, then why not just lease the school? It's cheap. And community.
And not to sidetrack you too much, but if you would have gone that route of saying, we got to get this, we got to work towards getting enough critical mass to be able to afford to have a building, how do you think your ministry would have looked differently today?
I don't know. That's a good question, because wow, Tom, I guess I could say it would look like any other church with a church building and a mortgage and, a group of people meeting in the church. The real question is would I have been able to lead a church to that? I'm guessing if that's the direction we would have gone, that church may be still going, but it probably wouldn't have me as its pastor. I don't see myself there.
Yeah.
And so honestly, that never was. If we ever had a building, the reason we wanted a building was because it would serve the needs of a community, not be a worship center.
Yeah.
We had at one time brainstormed and looked for properties that we could purchase that might have become a community center. Yeah. And we even made a run at a former Masonic temple lodge here in Olathe to try and do that. But the reality is that never caught in the sales. It never became something. And I haven't ever really looked back. I don't know if we would have ever been a viable church.
Yeah.
Because I don't know that my leadership could have taken us there that way.
Well, and I want to kind of tease that out a little bit, because I feel like we default to kind of our experience, I think, as leaders a lot of times, and we default to the paradigms that we understand. And it's very easy for us to fall into a paradigm that we don't naturally fit into, that doesn't represent our unique gifts or contributions to the kingdom of God. We just are, well, this is the template, and this is what a pastor looks like. And so at some point we gotta grow up and become a fully formed adult church, which looks like a building and these things that you traditionally see. So for you're meeting in a school and you're trying to pursue this this mission, and you're still not, even though you're kind of still trying to be faithful to this original vision, that's not kind of filling this, the sales aren't filling up with wind there. So what's that process like when you're kind of at this and you're excited and it's just not happening? What's the conversation that you're having with your team, with your people?
Prayer and practice. It's just, we continue to pray. Is this the right thing? We continue to talk about that as leadership. We continue to talk about that with the whole church. What ended up happening was, in the process of praying and trying to discern, one of the guys in our church came and said, hey, there's this group that his company had people who were employed out of the state penitentiary in Kansas, in Lansing. Mm-hmm. And he said, some of these guys really get it. They get their faith. They get what's going on. They are hard workers. They're making life change, and they get it.
Yeah.
So Randy Reinhardt, we were meeting in their basement. Now we're in the school. Randy says they come out and do worship services with people. They share testimonies and do all that. So I said, well, let's try it. And so we invited them to come out and share a worship service with us. That was the tip of the fulcrum for us. The teeter-totter went the other way.
And how did you know that? Like, how was that? Like, wow, there's something different about this than this other thing we were trying to do.
So God made it obvious. So this group of about 12 guys come in. They did a worship set. Everything went great. Guy shared his testimony. And his testimony was, I'm in prison for murder because I was a part of a gas station robbery that took place 4 blocks from this school. And when that robbery went down, the gas station attendant was killed. I was driving the car, and so I'm serving, I'm a part of that crime.
Yeah.
And so he said, I'm serving my sentence right now, but I've never had a chance to come back to this community and apologize and ask for forgiveness.
Wow.
So then another guy got up and preached, and then we had intentionally planned a pizza lunch for everybody afterward. And I didn't know what this would look like. I was a little nervous, especially after hearing the testimony. I was a little nervous. What's their kind of still gentle little kind of nice church plant going to do with these guys coming in?
Because this is different. So, Matt Thomas, correct? From Freeman?
Yes. Yeah.
So Matt was on last week.
Mm-hmm. And he was in Brothers in Blue.
Yeah, and so he's doing it, but he's coming at it from, I was incarcerated, so I understand these guys because I was them, and so his ministry is made up of people that are primarily they've been in that place and they're kind of like reaching their hand back.
Right.
But that's not you guys.
No, we were just typical South Johnson County church. Maybe not typical. We were just a Johnson County church.
Johnson County people that nothing exceptional in the sense of like you don't have these crazy stories. You don't have a bunch of people with criminal records that have a real heart for people who are incarcerated.
Just real broken people. That's all we are. Nothing special.
Yeah.
Nothing special in our story. Nothing special in my background. So they come in. That Sunday, we had several guests that were there because they came to hear these guys speak. Some of them were families. Some of them just knew them. And one of the guys that came, he and his wife, was the guy that taught many of these guys how to weld at Randy's company. And so he had heard they were going to be in Olathe, so he just decided to come out. Didn't go to church anywhere, doesn't go to church anywhere. 50 years hadn't gone to church. So at the end of the worship service, one of the first things that happened is we tell everybody we're going to go get dinner or lunch together. And I said, would our church please be intentional to make sure that there is a spot available at your table for one of the Brothers in Blue?
Yeah.
And our church literally ended up, first of all, lining up to hug this guy's neck that just shared his testimony and say, we're so glad you're here.
Yeah.
Well, that blew me away because I really expected people to say, you sit at that table over there, but they didn't.
Yeah, man.
But then our church not only made space for them, but pursued them. they went out and found them and said, come and sit with us and tell us your story and let us share with your story. And that lunch went way longer. We were way over time that day at the school.
Yeah.
But then the other thing that happened was Dennis, the guy who came to visit, who he and his wife had not been to church pretty much since they got married. Dennis came up and he said, do you do funerals? And I thought, that's a weird question, man. For a guy I just met, that's a weird question. I said, well, I do. He said, well, then this is the church we're going to start attending. And I said, well, Dennis, that's great. Where have you guys been attending? He said, I haven't attended church with my wife since we got married. I don't attend church.
Wow.
But if you're going to treat men like this way, then I can be a part of it. Come to find out later, he had 2 sons that were incarcerated.
Wow.
So that became, how God couldn't make it more obvious.
So when you go home that night and you're sitting with your wife after this day, you know, as pastors do, you know, reviewing your Sunday, I mean, what's that conversation like as you're kind of processing all that's just happened? Because this wasn't, you didn't script that this was going to happen. This, God just kind of shows up. And so, I mean, I can only imagine the conversation you have at home that night.
Yeah, the conversation was really kind of like you just described. What just happened? And what does this mean? And how, you know, it wasn't even so much a conversation as much as questions. What does this mean? How do we put this into action? Where do we even serve in Johnson County like this? I mean, these folks are living all the way up in Lansing and they can't come every Sunday to our church.
All right.
So what happened out of that, don't forget, I'm still on the Drug and Alcoholism Council.
Sure.
So I'm already hearing about programs that Johnson County Corrections is doing. Again, I cannot chalk this up to dumb luck because I'm not that lucky.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is within 2-3 weeks, now we are, so what's that, 10? So 11. So it is December of 2011. I'm invited to go to a program training called Strengthening Families. And in 2011, Johnson County Corrections, at the end of that training, short story, I promise it'll be short. So we get through the training, 2-day training. And at the end of the training, there were probably 50 people in the room, Johnson County government, nonprofits, Safe Home, police, myself. I was the only pastor in the room. Everybody else, we go around the room. How can we make strengthening families happen in our community? Johnson County said, we can't do it at our place because we have to lock the building at a certain hour and people just can't be in there afterwards. Safe Home said, no, we can't have whole families coming on site. That's not safe. Johnson County Mental Health said, we can only provide meals and childcare for the client we serve. We can't do it for the whole family. And it came around to me and I said, well, I don't have any of your barriers.
Yeah.
If you need a church, a building, even though we don't have one, I have 5 different pastors who have buildings empty every day of the week except for Sunday and Wednesdays.
Yep.
And I said, if you need transportation, the vans are sitting idle the same days. I said, if you need a meal, our church sneezes and a potluck comes out. It just happens with us.
Mm-hmm. And
then I said, if you need volunteers in childcare, we already have people that are childcare certified and they've gone through background checks.
Yeah.
I said, here's the problem with us. We're a church of 40 people. And by the time we do this twice, everybody in the church will have had strengthening families and we're done.
Yeah.
I don't have your referrals. So then, of course, the discussion was, well, we can't partner with the church. But who are the most desperate organizations in any community? Corrections. And so Corrections came up to us and said, well, we would like to explore that partnership. We met several times through the next couple months. We set up a memorandum of understanding. We agreed that this would not be a faith-based program, that we would kind of leave that discussion at the door. And there was a lot of resistance in Corrections, but they needed to run some evidence-based programs, some good programs that would help families. And I knew this was a good program from my time on the Drug and Alcoholism Council because I'd heard the presentations about it.
Yeah.
And so we got our people trained and we started running Strengthening Families. And they called it, for 2.5 years, they called it a pilot because they just couldn't say we're partnering with a church. And by the end of that 2.5 years, it was actually written into the county performance measures. So they saw this as a program that was there to stay.
Wow.
Then opportunities began to open up. I was invited to be on the Criminal Justice Advisory Council for Johnson County. I was invited to be on the Community Corrections Advisory Board.
Yeah.
Along this time, go back to the story of Dennis Wright, one of my guys who came to Christ during Brothers in Blue, now is volunteering, helping serve meals during this program, says to me, Lee, we can train people to weld. And now we're just about 3 years ago. We can train people, or no, about 7 years ago. We can train people to weld. And so we started doing a welding program, and then pretty quickly realized they needed more than just welding, they needed life skills. And 3 years ago, we launched a nonprofit. And so I don't get paid full-time by the church. If we were that other church, maybe I would be getting paid full-time.
Yeah.
But I don't get paid full-time. But what I am able to do is be co-vocational. But we built the other vocation.
Yeah.
And now that board is seated with people from faith communities from across Johnson County and people that don't have a faith story yet. And I say yet because for the first time, they're in a room doing the work that they're passionate about with people who are doing it because they are followers of Christ.
Yeah. So as you're talking, I've sat in your seat now and followed in your footsteps a little bit, kind of like benefiting from the trail that you've blazed in some of these arenas. But, I know that sometimes the question comes out of, well, how is this really mission? You're not, if it's not a faith-based program, then why does a church have any business doing it? But where do you see the benefit? How do you see this as like a faithful engagement of church resources, even though it's not, inherently faith-based? How do you see it as like, yeah, we know this is where God would have us be?
So, so that's where you and I've had these conversations, and you continue to slip into this language of something being inherently faith-based. What does that mean, Tom?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be inherently faith-based? This is inherently faith-based. The Christ in me walks into a room with families that are in chaos every time we do Strengthening Families. The Christ in me is in, and I do not have to share chapter and verse. We forget that Christ's mission, when he knelt next to the prostitute, those are the people I'm kneeling next to. When he knelt next to the prostitute who was about to be stoned, he didn't quote chapter and verse of Leviticus about why she should be stoned, or he didn't quote one of the Psalms about God's mercy. He confronted her accusers, and then he said to her, now go and sin no more.
Yeah, yeah.
My whole point is that time between confronting the unjust systems that are challenging people, or even if we consider those just systems, that they are suffering the consequences of their own poor decisions. However you want to look at it, from that time to the time where you say, go and sin no more, for me, is more elongated than it was for Christ. And do you blame me? I'm not Jesus.
Right. Well, and when I was talking with Matt last week, I mean, he shared about, I wanted to get a sense of what is it like to be that person who's just, either at the end of their sentence or just been paroled. And you kind of spoke to it earlier with the experience of, people coming to your church, but I would imagine people coming out of being in an incarcerated situation aren't expecting the church to be the most welcoming place for them. They're not their expectation is they're going to have probably doors slammed in their face. So when they have doors open to them, I would imagine that leaves quite an impact, and not just for people who've been incarcerated, but just in general. For some reason, our world has gotten the sense of the church being a condemning presence more than a welcoming presence. And so, I mean, I've, through your connections, we've hosted now Strengthening Families for a couple seasons. And yeah, it's amazing to see the walls break down when it's like, oh, you're a pastor, but you're not like in like robes and stuff like that, and like standing up at a pulpit pointing your finger. And it's just a whole different, once it's just we're two people having a conversation, it's a whole different dynamic, right?
So your church already has these people doing this work.
Right.
You have people working with Johnson County Human Services. Those people walk into their jobs governed by the same Christ that I serve.
Right.
They don't have to show chapter and verse. They don't have to sit there and quote the gospel or lead somebody to Christ for people to be convinced that they care about them, that they have value, intrinsic value. Where is the gospel in that? The gospel is found in the ability to communicate to others that you have value because God has given you value.
Yeah. Yeah.
That itself is the gospel message. And if we can't figure out how to go out and empower our churches to be in their communities and live that message, what is compelling about the story of Jesus is not, get back to youth ministry, what I told you. That's why teens were leaving the church. What was compelling about the church for them was they were going on mission trips. They were taking their friends who didn't know Jesus on canoe trips. They were playing basketball. They had their pastors coming to visit them at lunchtime on the schools. I mean, what was engaging about them was Christ was everywhere.
Right.
And they didn't have to talk about it everywhere. It just was. It permeated their lives. And so I wanted a church that looked that way.
Yeah. No, I've said, I mean, you and I are both, youth ministry veterans, and I've told anybody who will listen that youth ministry prepares you for anything ministry wise. I feel like there's so much that you cannot fake it. You cannot fake, your heart for people. You cannot fake compassion. I mean, I guess you can, but the people who last in youth ministry are the ones who are just real people who show up in a consistent way and treat people with love and grace and meet those teenagers where they're at. And if you just translate those concepts to anybody, regardless of what age you are, I think they're kind of universal ministry concepts. So you find yourself, so you started a church, you want to meet gaps in the community, you tried a certain direction, that didn't turn out to be the way, you kind of sort of seems like stumble into this gathering where you invite some people to lead worship, it opens a whole new door, and now you have this nonprofit. So how does this come to be, and so what's happening with that? Because that seems like something you could have never predicted on your own, but now here you are.
Never saw this. And let's face it, Tom, seminary doesn't prepare us for this kind of stuff.
It does not.
Seminary prepares us for the theological work that we do within the churches and the care ministries that we do within churches, but not for starting your own nonprofit, basically your own business.
Yeah.
So how that worked was one of the hurdles for going the next level with Johnson County Corrections was we kept trying to take that next step in relationship as Christ the servant church.
Mm-hmm.
On behalf of Johnson County Corrections, we needed to take that next step without the baggage of being called the church.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong, Corrections has ample Bible studies, people who come in and do treatment programs like Celebrate Recovery.
Right.
They're all of those things, they welcome those. But we wanted to go deeper. And the reason we wanted to go deeper, Tom, was this was now a trending concept for me.
Yeah.
Was I realized that all of a sudden it was more than just Corrections said, we need something that you have, and we are willing to let you bring that thing in. Corrections was now saying to me, how can we do more of this? How can we engage more with people in the community?
Yeah. Well, and as we've gotten to know each other, it seems like you've moved from being sort of this outsider coming in that wants to be helpful, that now you're kind of part of the fabric of a system. You know,
Right.
I mean, I was at a hearing in the city of Lenexa about a homeless shelter a few weeks ago, and you helped co-write a, you know, a petition that, you know, so there's now it's not like the church and the county, there's sort of like this intermingling, right? That's happening.
Right. In a sense, it's intermingling. In a sense, what's happened is, so when I came first on the Criminal Justice Advisory Council, Annabeth Serbaugh was the chair of the council at the time, and she invited me to come on. She knew me from things that we had already been doing. And she said, when I interviewed to come on the council, she asked me, she said, what do you plan on doing this for? And I said, I plan on doing it because I want to be a part of strengthening the fabric of our county.
Yeah.
I want to be a part of being a community connection. And when I come in the room, I see all county paid people. I don't see any community people.
Yeah.
So I want to be one of those.
Yeah.
And she said, well, I hope you really do that, because we've had ministers come on before and all they do is talk about getting people connected to their church or to a church.
Yeah.
And so I came on that council with the purpose of becoming a part of the solution, not offering a product.
Yeah.
And so in doing that, that increased that audience. And I think these are some of the reasons Paul was called into audience with leaders who were not faith community leaders in his day.
Yeah.
That he saw beyond just building a group of constituents to becoming a part of the fabric of a community and letting those values and those concerns permeate the community from a grassroots level into the county government.
Yeah.
So you're right, that has continued to where I just finished a 2-year engagement with Johnson County to redo the way the Adult Residential Center handles programs, and our program is one of the key programs that will be a part of the Adult Residential Center for the next decade.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is because I committed to becoming a part of a voice. The caution here, Tom, and I want to give you a caution. I love getting to share this part of the story. The caution is that people will look at that and say, well, I could never get there, so I don't know where to start. I want to remind you, this all came from us praying and saying, what are the needs in our community? And every one of us can glean those needs by reading the Johnson County Sun, by listening to a handful of county government web Facebook Lives when our county board of county commissioners has meetings. With a handful of ways, we can dip into our community's need and ask, what do they need?
Well, and even, I mean, I started going to the continuum of care meetings, and I haven't really been since COVID. And I've just been doing them over Zoom, but it was always really fascinating to me that there's not a whole lot of faith-based, not that there aren't believers around the circle, but
Right.
there's very few people that are sitting around that circle saying, I am a pastor, or I am a rabbi, or I am a faith leader. Most of them are part of an organizational, you know, a different entity. And it's amazing that there just aren't that many, pastors that are showing up in those settings to just listen.
So when we get back to that very first part of our conversation, one of the images that I've had for the church is that a lot of times the church looks like a fountain, beautiful, filled with living water, flowing and cascading down all these tiers. And if you want to do that, you can come to that fountain and you can dip your hands in there and you can partake.
Yeah.
The church, we have plenty of fountains in our community that are beautiful, invitational settings.
Yeah.
We need more living streams.
Yeah.
That risk going out into the community, evaporating, running over muddy ground, getting a little bit dirty, but just those streams of living water that find their way through the cracks and the gaps in the community and fill those spots with living water.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other part of the conversation that it's important to note as well, in case anybody gets any ideas, it isn't like since you've gotten so integrated into the fabric of Johnson County that your church is like blown up in membership, right? It's not like, well, now that we're doing this, we've got 2,000 people and now we have to
No.
be, it hasn't really led to like numerical growth, but that's not really the point, right? I mean, that's not really, it would be nice. It'd be nice to have that as a byproduct, but.
Right. No, that's not what's happened. And no, I don't even think it would be nice if that was a byproduct. Because in the end, if that was a byproduct, what would I do with my time? I would have to focus on the organizational structure of that church.
Yeah.
If I could mourn one thing that we have not been able to do as a church is plant another church.
Yeah.
Because we've never had that mass to split off and plant.
Yeah.
And I would have done it if we would have gotten up to 50, 60 people. I'd have said, hey, half of you need to go find your own house.
Yeah.
I mean, we run about 35, 40 on a Sunday with kids and everything, all the folks counted.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, Tom. What hasn't happened is the church has exploded. What has happened, and this isn't to brag, it's just to be honest. What has happened is the chair of the county commission knows who I am and knows that I'm a pastor.
Yeah.
The director of corrections calls me to have conversations about things related to the department.
Yeah.
There are people that call me and ask for opinions. Judges have invited me to come and participate in things with them.
Yeah.
That's, to me, that was the glory of what Paul did, was he figured out how to be both firmly planted in the church and firmly planted in civic affairs.
Yeah.
And in doing so, it gave him an audience with the Areopagus, but it also gave him an audience where he could walk into any house in Corinth and speak.
Yeah. Yeah. Man, and it's such a different target from most churches. I mean, it's just a different, you're shooting for, you're playing a different game in a sense. I mean, it's I guess the same league, but it's a different, you have different equipment. You're not trying to accomplish the same, you are trying to accomplish the same overall goal, but just going about it in a totally different way than most churches.
So I'll share a story with you. One of the surprising things is the clients we serve, the people we serve, there have been some of those folks who've come to the church and stayed. They felt like they were being loved. They had no church home. They didn't even know what a church home was. And they experienced that acceptance and love outside of the church. So they ended up coming to the church. We have quite a few families who are a part of our church today that are that way. What was interesting is 3 times over the course of us getting engaged, I've had people who were staff with corrections ask me, why do you do this?
Yeah.
One of those, and she recently moved, one of those, I remember the day that she called me up and she said, Lee, I've got a personal question I need to ask you. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, I think I'd like to read the Bible. Bible would I read? And so we talked about versions of the Bible, and I ended up buying her a version of the Message and got it for her. And we had conversations about what she was reading.
Yeah, man.
Never came to the church.
Right.
But I think that's the work of the church.
Yeah.
Build relationships.
Yeah. Man, I know we're getting to the home stretch here. I want to make sure you get an opportunity to talk about. So you did, this nonprofit is up and going. What are some of the things that are happening through
Sure. NCircle is the name of our nonprofit. We talk about encircling those that we serve. with community supports and with anything we can do to help them live a new and vibrant life outside of corrections. We primarily serve families or individuals who've been impacted by the criminal justice system. And we do 3 big programs. We still do strengthening families. Because of COVID, we've hit a pause, but January, we're planning on starting back up. We do a program called Discovery, which is a teen group that helps teens who are currently court involved discern what is it that they want in life, because none of them want to stay in corrections, and we want to start breaking some of those cycles before they get to adult corrections. And then the third program is called the College of Trades, and that is our big program that we run at the Adult Residential Center in Johnson County, working with clients to get them a skilled trade, mentoring, and some kind of life skills for how to keep and get and keep a job. So those are our 3 programs. We continue to look for individuals who would like to mentor. And from us, mentoring means meeting once every couple of months, maybe for an hour, or every couple of weeks, maybe for an hour a week, or an hour each meeting. And just being there to be a sounding board for clients. Many of them don't have parents that are a sounding board for them, or other trusted adults that are a good sounding board. Most of them are coming out of environments where all of their sounding boards are saying, do the wrong thing with this, because this is much more fun than doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So we want to introduce them to new sounding boards, and my well for finding those sounding boards is the church. Some of them will have a faith story and want to have a faith story. Some of them will say, no, I don't really want to talk about the faith stuff. And if somebody's uncomfortable with that, we'll find somebody that they're comfortable talking about. There are all kinds of ways to get involved, but what's happened is we have found faith community leaders in their own churches that teach our life skills, that are now one of our co-funded positions. We fund part of a position at Johnson County Community College for a transition coach for folks coming out of incarceration. Our new program director is a wonderful, she came out of the child welfare system, but is just a faith-filled woman that has clear convictions about helping people with second chances and redemption. So we find ways to help mobilize the church. That's what we do. We want to have people of faith come and be willing to simply build relationships and trust that simply by kneeling next to someone and showing that you care, that the conversation will turn to the things that bring about eternal change.
Yeah. So if someone would want to get involved or learn more about, how would they do that? Where would I send them?
NCircle.org.
Okay.
NCircle.org. And you can read about our programs. You can contact me through that. We're constantly putting new things out. We do have, if you go to NCircle Together at Facebook, if you're a LinkedIn type, I do almost all of my posts are on LinkedIn. You can go to NCircle Together at LinkedIn. And those are the places you can start gleaning a little bit of information about what we do.
Man, that's awesome. As we kind of wrap up our time today, man, it went fast. I feel like our hour kind of just, it scooted right by, which is typical for us. But if you had a room full of pastors who are in all different kinds of settings, and you had, a couple of minutes to share a heart for community engagement, or, we've been kind of talking about in a roundabout way, asset-based community development. What kind of a plea would you make to pastors and ministry leaders, and maybe just what plea would you make to the church? What would you love to see? Maybe, and this, I'm asking like multiple questions, but what would you love to see the legacy of the Church of Kansas City, or maybe what the Church of Kansas City is ultimately known for?
Wow.
They're easy questions. These are softballs, right?
So I was in a meeting with a handful of faith leaders and several chiefs of police from across Johnson County. So every city, of course, has its own police department. These were chiefs of police. And this was kind of the question. What can the church do in this space related to race and, you know, other disparities across Johnson County around homelessness, around all the social challenges that the police see daily and that some church folks are addressing. And so the question really was laid out. What are you doing? And one of the things that I communicated to the group is we need to be better at advocating for others, even if they're not a part of our communities, but advocating for others, advocating for the homeless, going to the continuum of care on homelessness, finding ways to serve and to actually advocate. It's one thing to serve a meal, Tom, and everybody in the church should go out and serve a meal or to provide some other support. But honestly, it's moving from that simple gift of support to then becoming advocates. And I think that's the thing that I would hope for the church across Kansas City, is that we would see more of our church members and our church leaders equipped and challenged from the pulpit in their discipleship to become advocates. Ultimately, I go back to the story, and this is kind of my model for ministry of Jesus kneeling next to the prostitute. The first thing he did was advocated for her.
Yeah.
By asking the rest of those around to identify who was without sin and had the right to cast the first stone.
Right.
And in doing that, he looks at her and says, now where are your accusers? He doesn't then say, see what I did for you? He says, now where are your accusers? Look up, they're gone. So advocacy.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Lee, I really appreciate your time to sit down and share your heart. I would love to have another conversation down the road. And I'm sure you and I will probably have multiple conversations just offline, but I appreciate your time with us. And so as we continue this journey of discovering how God is working in the greater community, want to just encourage you every Wednesday night at 8:00. This debuts live on YouTube, and coming soon, this will also be in podcast form on Spotify and hopefully Apple Podcasts coming very soon, so you can listen to it as you're during your commute or as you're going out and working out. But let's stay plugged into what God is doing and join him in his big mission. So thanks, Lee, and thanks everybody for joining us this week. We'll take care.